Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, it's a marriage of the minds with Connecticut's esteemed husband and wife duo of James Benn and Deborah Mandel. A former librarian and journalist, James Benn is the author of the venerable Billy Boyle World War II mysteries. The series' 16th entry, Road of Bones, was just published by Soho Press and continues to explore little-known aspects of the era. Publishers Weekly gave Road of Bones a starred review noting outstanding, bolstered by vivid, scintillating descriptions of airstrikes and dogfights involving the legendary all-female Soviet Air Force unit known as the Night Witches. Benn's high-intensity storytelling shines. This entry will leave fans eager for the next installment. A freelance copy editor and retired psychotherapist, Deborah Mandel is the author of All Right, How to Start, Structure, and Sustain a Writing Group, a nonfiction guide based on her experiences with, and including input from, the Shoreline Writers Group that she co-founded. Reader Thomas J. Watson praised, "I found this book to be fascinating and instructional. The book includes many tips that are applicable even to writers who fly solo. This one goes on my reference shelf, right next to the Chicago Manual of Style and Strunk and White's Elements of Style." Not only do James Benn and Deborah Mandel share their lives together, but a deep love of writing and a respect for the craft, which requires great discipline and sacrifice in the continual pursuit of satisfaction and success. Fortunately, love and laughter lead the way, as you'll soon see. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. So I am going to call this episode the Dynamic Duo Edition because we have two authors, life partners. Very exciting. I don't think I've ventured into this territory before, but who better to do it with? So today we have Deborah Mandel, who is the author of How to Start, Structure, and Sustain a Writing Group. And I have to say that those are three very distinct but very important S's in that title right there. And then next to Debbie, we have James Benn, who is author of Road of Bones, the 16th Billy Boyle World War II mystery. So welcome to the show, my friends.
Thank you. Great
Thanks,
to be
John.
here.
This is fun. We'll see how our relationship goes once we're done.
That's right. I was going to say you can say it's fun now because we're only beginning, but we'll see if you're
Right.
smiling at the end. We're all about suspense here. So just so people know, I'm going to structure this a little bit differently than my normal show. So I'm going to start with some questions that particularly pertain to writing groups in a more sort of general sense, since you both have some experience with that. Then I will have some specific questions for Debbie, some specific questions for you, Jim, and then at the end, again, a couple of questions for you both. But I have heard that you have this great dynamic where you like to interject. So I'm kind of looking forward to see what, you both
We
have
call
to
it
say about each
interrupting.
other's
That's
book.
okay.
Fun. Okay, so I figured I would start with this. You have both come to writing, obviously, but you've also lived very distinguished lives outside of this world. So I'm wondering if you can give us a brief background and how that's either led you to writing or informed your writing. And I will start with you, Debbie.
Well, thank you. So first, I brought a little show and tell because I've been writing books evidently since I was quite young.
Oh,
And
look at that.
I have a 2-volume book on math that I just found, I don't know, maybe about 2 years ago when my mother passed away. She had saved these. And so I've been writing books evidently since I was in 7th grade. But my background, my professional background is I'm a psychotherapist, specifically dealing with trauma. And I started my practice way back in the 80s, at the very beginning of the issues of trauma even coming to the forefront. I mean, people didn't know about incest. People didn't talk about sexual assault. People didn't talk about domestic violence. And my writing actually started way back then in the 80s. I had a colleague, and together we decided we were going to write a workbook on how to deal with trauma because we were some of the earlier therapists work in the area of trauma. So we sat down and we wrote about 5 or 6 chapters. And then out came this book, The Courage to Heal by Laura Bass and Laura Davis. And I'm sorry, Ellen Bass and Laura Davis. And there went our book. So we scrapped that. So then a number of years later, one of the areas of trauma that I worked in was with multiple personality disorder, which I'm sure everybody's heard of Sybil or the three faces of Eve. And again, that was a very new in the field to be working with this. So I had a former client who had multiple personality disorder, and together we decided we were going to write a book about her and her therapy, et cetera. And it was nonfiction. We wrote, I don't know how many chapters, 8 or 10 chapters, sent it off to agents. And all the responses I got back were, no, that's been done. There's the three faces of Eve and there's Sybil. Nobody's going to want to read about multiple personality disorder again. Well, so I scrapped that book. And then a couple of years later, the market was just glutted with books about. So far I'm batting zero in my writing, my professional writing. Then a number of years later, I was asked to co-write a book with a state trooper who had post-traumatic stress disorder from his involvement in 2 on-the-job shootings. And that was an intense book. And we did that. And I thought it was great. We should send it out to publishers. And he was in such a hurry to get out. He said, no, let's just self-publish.
Right.
So that was great. But again, it didn't go anywhere. So fast forward, when I retired, I now had the time to write. And so here I am.
That's terrific. All the retired people I know are busier in retirement than they were in their working years, which is terrifying.
Totally.
How about you, Jim? Where did you come from to lead you to this place?
Well, I have had a career mainly in the library field, and looking back on it, I changed jobs pretty often, mostly because I really didn't like going to work, and I thought, well, if I get a different job, it'll be, I'll like it better. But I always wanted to write, and I think my kind of nomadic job experience had to do with just not being satisfied with that kind of office job. And as I also looked into the archives, and as proof that I should have taken up a writing career earlier, I found, speaking of writing groups, I was in a writing group in 1963. It was called Period 5 English. And I still have a story I wrote. And it's interesting in that I'm just going to read you the opening paragraph. This is 1963. Story of a spy. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Normandy was invaded by the Allied forces. But on the night of January 1st, 5 days earlier, it was invaded by Sergeant William Blaine. My teacher wrote, good opening. And in a lesson, I remembered this even before I knew I still had this paper. She wrote on the back, B+. I thought it was A, but A level, but a promising story, possibly too easy for the sergeant, but interesting. So the sergeant is the protagonist, who's a spy. And I literally never forgot that, because I did make it too easy. He just breezed through his assignment. So I had the hero's journey, but I didn't have the obstacles yet. So I diverted from, age 14, I did the usual go to work thing, but I really just always wanted to be a writer, and finally got around to it. So I do have a background in libraries. I'm a librarian, I've been a library director, worked in different library organizations, was involved in computer technology, but I like this a whole lot better.
You also left out an important part of your career.
What's that?
You were a journalist.
Oh, that's, yeah.
Should we show the picture?
Sure, yeah. I worked for a newspaper out of college. And again, that was writing, and it taught me how to type fast. And I just found a picture that I took when it was taken of me. I covered Woodstock. And if you can see down in the corner, that's me.
That's you.
And that's Jimi Hendrix, on stage with Jimi Hendrix. So it's been all downhill since then.
I was going to say, who's that guy who was lucky enough to be in your presence? But Jimi Hendrix, sure. I commend you both for digging into the archives. You've done your homework, and it's great to see that you've both come completely full circle. That's pretty wild. Visual aids and everything.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, Debbie, just generally, what inspired you to form the Shoreline Writers Group, and what advice would you give to others, who are either looking to establish their own group or to join a group that is already in existence?
Well, I've actually been in two groups. And in the early 2000s, I was in a group as well called the Secret Society of Shoreline Writers. I don't know why. And that lasted for a few years. But both of my groups came out of taking lifelong learning courses at Wesleyan University. Mm-hmm. They offer these great courses that are, inexpensive and don't take up a whole lot of time, like if you were going back to a full-time course at Wesleyan. And the first one I took was an editing course that I took so I could start editing Jim's books because he needed a little help in that area. And the second one was a memoir writing course. After both of these classes, there were several of us who wanted to keep going. I connected both times with different groups of women. They happen to be women. They don't have to be women, obviously, who were writing books and wanted to keep it, felt that getting feedback from other people. So with this second group, we got together. The four of us, we passed a sheet around the whole room, and anybody who was interested could sign up and join the group. And that started Shoreline Writers Group. And 6 years later, here we are. So I would really encourage people to take classes because there's a lot to learn about the art of writing, the craft of writing. And it's a great place to meet other writers that you can then connect with and form up and have this ongoing wonderful support group.
That's terrific. And so I don't reveal my sources, journalist myself here, Jim, but I did hear that you had some involvement in a writers group for a period of time beyond that classroom setting that you were telling us about. So I'm wondering if you can tell us how you found that group and what you took away from that experience, what sticks with you.
I also took a class, a graduate class at Wesleyan, and it was on writing a novel. And I had been looking for a writing class or group, and there was plenty of stuff about how to write a short story. But when I saw it was called Taking the Deep Breath, writing a novel, and it was taught by Rachel Bosch, who's a novelist. And I immediately signed up because that was as rare as could be, is a whole semester dedicated to writing. I had already had 2 Billy Boyle manuscripts written, unsold, and I wanted to work on them some more. And that was a fantastic class, and Rachel was a great instructor. And just as Debbie said, when the class was finished, there was a core of us that wanted to continue. So we would meet at Rachel's house and critique each other's works. And that was just a terrific experience because these were people who were really dedicated to writing, dedicated to accepting critical input, which is so important. And that's one of the things that's hard about sustaining a writing group, is finding people who can give and take criticism. But that group was terrific. And there was one central piece of writing advice that I got out of it. And it was from Rachel, who wrote on, it was another note, like my teacher's note, on a chapter I had been working on. And she said, Jim, remember, the story has to move down as well as forward. And that was like, oh my God, of course. And it was putting it in that context allowed me to take the character and work a little more deeply with him. So I got a tremendous amount out of that. And I don't think I'd be exactly where I am today without that experience.
Sure. And what great advice. I like that. And Debbie, so let me ask you, being a part of a writing group, can you tell me how you feel that it's most benefited you, both in terms of writing itself and also that ongoing development of your editing and critiquing skills?
In my first group, when we got together, we just read what we wrote and we were just really nice to each other, and this is all great. It was a fun social club almost. But in my second group, we decided that we really needed to learn the craft of writing. And we needed to dedicate time to doing that. So we would go off independently, we might, or, sometimes together, we'd go off and we'd take classes and workshops, et cetera, and bring them back to the group and share what we learned. But we also spent some time almost every week practicing the craft. And we would choose a topic we wanted to learn about. Someone would put together a little presentation for the group, would share that, and then we would create these exercises. And, we would do a lot of work around learning, like, say, how to use metaphors or how to develop metaphors or how to show, not tell, that kind of stuff. So we were very focused on learning the craft of writing in order to enhance our own skills. And in terms of how it has helped finesse my editing and critiquing, we also were very committed to editing each other's work. So we were very structured. You could bring in a chapter. When you finished a chapter, you brought in a chapter, you read it to the group. Now I'm going to take that a step back. You sent it to the group the week before so we could read it. We would edit it. Then the following week, the author would read her chapter, and then we'd share our editing and critiquing with her. And I found that I just got way more involved in the editing side of it. And I was enjoying that even more than the writing sometimes. So that really, I had 3 books to edit every week on top of all the stuff that Jim gives me to edit, which is kind of this nonstop. He's so prolific. So I was getting a lot of experience editing. So I went and I took more editing classes. I took an editing certification course. And I just found that kind of fits my personality. I like organizing and I like getting all the ducks in a row, and I get to do that in editing.
That's terrific. And you both sort of touched on the fact that it really is an art, both to be able to give and receive, constructive feedback, which is something that you do have to work at and develop it, which is very interesting. And Jim, I wanted to ask you, Debbie just mentioned how prolific you are. And, now that you're sort of writing more in isolation or in a more solitary place, even, before we started talking, we were speaking about, before we started recording, how every day is sort of the same for a writer. It doesn't matter if it's Monday, Thursday, Sunday, you're writing. What do you credit, now that you're not sharing your work with a group, to keeping that discipline? What keeps you going when you're home and there's all these other things that could easily distract you?
Well, especially after the last couple of years, it's been great to have the distraction of the idyllic pace of World War II to retreat to, in the face of pandemics and politics and insurrection. I actually enjoy escaping into my fictional world, and all my friends in my head. We have a great time. But there's sort of just a drive to create and work in that environment that I find invigorating. And when I don't have a current project, which is every now and then, I feel a little lost, like what should I be thinking about? I don't know. I have to say the pandemic hasn't been good for me, but the lockdown worked pretty well to have the time to work on that and the desire. And it's very helpful to have Debbie as my first editor, first reader, and first editor. And we've devised a process now where when I finish a chapter, I read it aloud to her. So that helps me see what needs to be fixed, helps her to keep the story straight, so that when I do give her the final manuscript to edit, she knows what the storyline is. And one reason, I like sending in as clean a copy as possible to my publisher. And I mentioned earlier that I had 2 Billy Boyles done before they were sold to Soho Press. And my editor there was Laura Hrusco, the original founder of Soho Press. So the first book, Billy Boyle, she sent back, and she worked on paper with red pencil. So, I'd get this mass, every page, literally every page had red on it. And it was an interesting process to work through, and she had a lot of good insight. And what I didn't quite realize is that I should have been working on the second manuscript to improve it before I sent it in. But I didn't. I just sent it in. And I got a note back from her, a very stern note that said, "Jim, you are now a professional writer. You have to do better than this." And oh my God, I got really yelled at by the teacher. But she was right. I had just taken it for granted that somebody else was going to do that work. So Debbie and I have teamed up to make sure that when the manuscripts go in, they're as clean as possible from an editing perspective, and also understandable, so that a reader who might not be well versed in World War II history will understand what's going on in the book. So we have our own little production team here, so it works out well.
Well, that's terrific, because not only are you accountable to yourself, but you are accountable to Debbie, and Debbie is accountable to you and her group. And I did want to ask you that too, Debbie, before we move into the more specific areas of conversation. But obviously, and we've broached this subject a bit already, you share your life and a house with a writer. You were a writer yourself. Can you talk a bit about how that benefits you, not only in terms of the craft itself, but also sort of in terms of the emotional realities of being a writer? Because it is a very distinct thing that if you are not a writer, you probably don't understand that aspect of writing.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think the most important to me is with living with Jim in terms of the writing is that I have this role model extraordinaire here. I give him the title of writer with a capital W, and I give myself the title of writer with a lowercase w. And I'm working on that. I'm trying to let that go. But he is so prolific as he sits down. He decided, actually, it was 22 years ago this weekend. He decided to, and that was his 50th birthday. That's the only reason I know that. He decided he was going to write. And we were on a vacation in Europe. He came home from we came home from the vacation, and he literally sat down in his chair the next day and started writing.
Wow.
And in 22 years, he's written 22 books and numerous short stories. So I see what it takes. I mean, I really do.
Right.
I can just sort of watch him and understand what the process is and learn from him, and just editing all of his stuff. I mean, I've read so much now, and I watch how he crafts things. So I just have.
But all this wouldn't not have happened if it wasn't for a question Debbie asked me. And this was on my 50th birthday dinner. We were on this trip in Europe. And this is where the psychotherapist part comes in. She asked me, "Well, what do you want to do with the next 50 years of your life?" And we were on a terrace in a restaurant in the Harz Mountains in Germany. I had this big stein of beer in front of me, and that's all I was focused on. And then she asked me this question that sort of knocked me back. And it came to me, I wanted to see if I could write a book. And if she hadn't asked that question from her perspective, which is much more wide-ranging than the beer in front of you, I don't know if I would have gone home and started writing and been here today. So again, it helps to have a differing perspective to help you see what it is you really wanted to do and give it a shot. Because really all I wanted to do was see if I could actually plot out a book and start in the beginning and finish it. I didn't have a lofty ambition about getting published. I just wanted to see if I could do it.
That's terrific. And so 22 books in 22 years is pretty impressive. Does that mean 28 more in the next 28 years, and then it'll be 50
Obviously,
books in 50 years?
Yeah. Matter of fact, I got to get to work tomorrow.
No pressure. So before we move into Deb's book specifically, I just wanted to ask you, you have been in this business for a while, and publishing is volatile. I mean, some things stay the same, but a lot of things shift and change. And just when you grow accustomed to something, it changes again and it morphs. And I'm just wondering, do you find that having that perspective in this business is helpful to someone like Deb, who is sort of an up-and-comer, and seeing that as crazy as things are, there are still avenues for success given the perspective that you have in sort of surviving and thriving in a volatile business?
I have no idea, because the publishing business is a little crazy. There's really no accounting for, well, not no accounting. Things happen without much rhyme or reason. So I don't know. And the thing is, people in publishing don't know either. You know, everybody seems to chase the latest trend. You know, you go to a bookstore and all of a sudden you see every woman running away from you in a red jacket. You know, so they haven't tired of that motif yet on a cover. So I don't know. All I know is that I've been able to create some characters that people find interesting and are invested in. Right. And that's really the only secret that I can uncork from, let the genie out, is that if people cleave to the characters and want to be part of their lives, they'll keep coming back.
Absolutely.
And that's about all I've learned.
No, that's, you know, fair enough. I mean, if you look into the crystal ball of publishing, it just looks murky. I mean,
yes, nobody knows.
No definition there. But so Deb, to talk a bit about All Right specifically, I wanted to ask you first, you know, this, I don't think you thought was going to be your first solo written published work. It just kind of happened. It was the right time, maybe. So I'm just wondering, what compelled you, you know, to prioritize this book over some of the fiction projects that you were working on?
Primarily what happened is that we had this great group, and I didn't have to do any work to write this book. I mean, this group—
You worked.
Well, yes.
You don't work at all.
But it was a different kind of, like, I didn't have to have this creative process kind of thing. Here was this great, it was like the other books I wanted to write. I could write books about trauma because I really knew trauma inside and out. And that's the way I felt about this group. I, like, all of a sudden one day I said, you know, guys, we really have this great process here. I think we ought to write a book. And very quickly the we became a me, because, you know, everybody was doing their own thing. Right. But I thought, no, we have, what we've developed here is something that we could share with the world, so everybody doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. And I did a little research. I went online, and if you Google writing groups, there are about 16 million things pop up, right? There's a lot of articles, but I couldn't find anyone that took it from the start, structure, and sustain. Everybody had their own little specialty. Everybody had this, you know, here's how you get together, or here's a few things you can do in the middle, or here's what some of the problems are. So I thought it would be great to put something just all together, so somebody could, you know, follow the guide and do it from A to Z. And as Jim said, the other thing was, I really wanted to finish a book. And this felt like a book that was doable, that I could start it, I could structure it, right, and I could sustain it. So I was able finally to finish a book. And then I decided, and I knew, because of all Jim's experiences, I know if you're writing nonfiction and you don't have a platform, there's no agent that's going to take you on. And you know, I sent out a few queries, but didn't even get responses. But because of all his experiences, I think that I knew where I stood. And so I chose to go to a hybrid publisher. And I said, I deserve this. I've written this book. I'm going to get it out there in the world, and we'll see where it goes. So it was just an exercise in getting a book written and out there.
Yeah, and you know, it's such a great overview of the writers group, and having been a part of one or two myself with interesting results. I mean, it is so important not only to structure the group, but to sustain it. Like, a lot of times you don't know what direction to take a group in. And so it's really great to have a guide, because it's nice when you have that group, but you have to sort of have a forward momentum and a mission and an agreement among the folks where you actually want to be, to hold each other appropriately accountable, but in a way that's understanding of everybody's life circumstances. And I wanted to ask you too, one of the things I really enjoyed about this book is your writers group, the other members, there's 3 other members, and they have voices in this book and they have contributions in this book. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, how they come through this book and what you think their contributions do to enhance the overall narrative that you give us.
I thought it was so important to have their voices in the book because I didn't create the group by myself. It was really the 4 of us who, were 4 very different people coming from different backgrounds, different careers, different ages, writing very different books. I was at the time writing fiction based on, I think the book I was working on at the time was based on a Vietnam vet that I had worked with. And so I was writing fiction, someone else was writing genealogies, someone else had this really great women's fiction, and another woman was writing a book about how to start developing your baby's brain in utero. So, we really came from 4 different directions. And because it took all 4 of us together, the sum of the parts is, what's that expression?
Greater than the whole.
Is greater than the whole.
Right.
I needed all of them. And I found that adding in their perspectives along the way would just give the reader a whole another layer of like the depth that Jim talked about. It just, I thought, brought more depth to have everyone's experiences, not just my own.
Yeah,
so it's pretty much a no-brainer to include them.
Right. And then there's so much personality and there's so much to relate to. And I just thought that that was a really terrific way to create a bit more engagement too, in addition to that depth. And I wanted to ask you too, another great element of this book is there's all of these really terrific interactive writing exercises, and they can be tailored very easily to a specific group's needs. So can you give us a few examples and tell us how you found that they've enriched your experiences in your own writers group?
Sure. As I said, we really wanted to learn the craft of writing, and we did that from the beginning. Besides what we did every week, we would yearly have a retreat that we would focus specifically on one, say, show don't tell. Right. And we would sort of, that's where a lot of these exercises came from, was developing them so we could hone our own writing skills. So one of my favorites is from Hemingway's Tip of the Iceberg theory, where he said, that the iceberg is only 10% shows and 90% is below the water. But if a writer is immersed enough in their subject matter, they can omit a lot of details. And if a writer writes well enough, the reader will implicitly know what they're talking about. And that was just, he shows doesn't tell so beautifully. So the exercise we created around that was to set up a series of scenarios where we would write a short story based on some suggestions that are listed in the book. Say, a woman, write a short story without telling who the character is or what's happened to the character, about someone like a woman whose husband has just died, and she's walking along a lake, but her husband was this mean, ornery bastard. Write a short story. Or a young man walking down the street in the city who's just killed someone. I think another example was a father who encouraged his daughter to join the military to carry on the family tradition, and he's just been notified that his daughter was killed in action. So what we would do is, for weeks, we would do this. You'd pick one of those scenarios, you'd write about it at home without saying who the character was or what the situation was. We'd bring them back to group, and then we'd read them, and we would work on critiquing them. Had the writer actually gotten across through her work?
And what, for instance, wasn't the one about the guy who had just killed someone? You're not supposed to say that he just killed someone.
Exactly.
But show his actions.
Right. You can't say what he's done. You can only, it's all built on show. And the other one, which is very similar, we call the show it short story, where during the week, one of us would mail a picture to everybody in the group, and something we found on the internet, or our own pictures. And it could be anything, a scene, could have people, it could have animals, didn't matter what it was. And we all had to write a short story using that picture as the setting. So again, it was another way, and we had to weave that setting, that had to show up in our short story.
Right.
So there were those two exercises to really hone the skill of show. And again, we did that one for months and months and months. And we really finessed our ability to, take the story, like Jim said, take the story deeper as well as forward.
That's great. And, the thing I love about those exercises is, as you mentioned, your group is very dynamic and you come from very different perspectives. You have different subject matter that you're exploring. But I think that these, sort of interactive elements, they help your group form a cohesive whole, because I think one of the risks with forming a writer's group where you're all writing different things is maybe there's not that sense of connectedness. And this sort of bridges that gap. And I keep thinking that would have been very probably beneficial in some of the groups that I've been in the past. So I can really appreciate that point. And sort of to piggyback on that, another really cool element of this book is at the end, we actually get excerpts from each member's work in progress, which is great because you hear a little bit about it throughout the book and then you actually get to see it in action. But I'm wondering if you can tell us specifically about your excerpt, because you have been at work on a YA novel, which people can read a few pages of in this book. And it's based on a very sort of dramatic real life experience. I mean, we've talked about trauma. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about that experience and how revisiting it through the lens of fiction versus fact has sort of helped in shaping your perspective with that.
So that book is entitled My Dead Body. And it's
great title.
and it's based on a situation that happened when I was a sophomore in high school. It was the last day of exams. A girlfriend and I decided when we left school to go to the beach. So we went to we live on the shore in Connecticut. We went to this beautiful little beach, and it was mid-May. We got out of school early, and we were walking down the beach and we saw this thing. And I remember we looked at each other and it's like, oh, what's that? And like, oh, maybe some driftwood. Let's go check it out. And we got there and it was a dead body. And it was a man who had, well, we later found out he'd been in the water for 3 months. So it was not a very pretty picture. And for me personally, it was traumatic because my dad had just died 2 years before. So I knew that this man had a family somewhere. And so that was one piece of it. The second piece was trying to get help, because we went across the street. We said, well, we need to call the police and let them know about this. And we went across the street to a woman, because we were teenagers and it was the 60s and nobody liked teenagers in the 60s. She wouldn't let us in her house. And we said, there's a dead body across the street, and it was a private beach. And she said, oh, on my beach? There's not a dead body on my beach.
We don't allow them.
We don't. And she lived in this big English Tudor home. I'll never forget it. And finally she relented and she said, well, you can go around to the back of the house. And, she let us in this back room in the house. So I called the police and they didn't believe me. They said, you teenagers, you're always wasting police time. And I mean, we just found this dead body and we were pretty upset about that. So the police is yelling at us, yelling at me on the phone. And the woman says, we can't use her address because she doesn't want to have anything to do with this. So now I have to tell the police officer, well, I can't tell you where we are, but I gave him a description. And then he came. Obviously, you can tell this is still like, get into this is like the PTSD part of trauma, right? You have to tell the story. But anyway, the police show up, and I'll never forget, this officer is walking us down, still lecturing us about wasting his time and how it costs money and teenagers today and blah, blah, blah. And we get to the edge of there was a wall and the beach was down below, and he looks over and he goes, oh my God, girls, don't look. And he like turned us around. It's like, okay.
Little late.
So anyway, so in writing, so I was never planning on writing that book, but I was in this course at Wesleyan, and she did this exercise, make a list of the number of things you have in your life, like how many dogs, So you write this whole list of dogs, 4, siblings, 2, this, how many houses have you lived in? 3. And in the middle of my list, I hadn't thought about this in years. I wrote dead bodies found, 1.
Right.
And then we had her read our list out loud, and she goes, "That's what your memoir is about." I was not planning on writing that book.
Right. That's
So anyway, that's how it came about, and it was good. It was very cathartic. I spewed out that book, and so much so that it was like 120,000 words. So it's sitting. That's sort of sitting in the computer, in the bowels of the computer, waiting to be edited.
Sure.
But it was a great process to be able to write that book.
Sure. Well, and the truth is stranger than fiction. Who would believe it? And speaking of that, I mean, Mr. Benn, we're going to move on to your book, and your fiction is based on truth. So there's that. So Road of Bones is the 16th Billy Boyle mystery, and I wanted to ask you just the bare bones, if you'll pardon the expression of the book, is that Billy is really drawn into an investigation that's essentially a locked room mystery, but it has very serious sort of international implications or consequences. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about that basic premise and how it drives the plot.
Okay. During the war, we the Americans had several air bases in the Soviet Union, and the idea was it would keep the Germans guessing, because instead of flying back to England after a bombing raid, they might fly to Russia, refuel, and from there they might bomb targets all across Europe. So it was to widen the strategic bombing campaign. And there were several things happened to bring this book into focus, and one was some genealogy that helped Debbie discover some family members. Much of her family was killed in the Holocaust in, the Ukraine or Poland. The border shifts so much, but in Eastern Europe. And a few years ago, a family member was doing genealogical research to find survivors, because so many people had been either murdered or scattered to the winds. And she discovered she had a cousin, much older. And so we met Cousin Abe, and oddly enough, he lived within a few blocks of her brother outside of Philadelphia. And Abe had been on a bomber crew in World War II. He'd even lost a thumb to flak. So we met Abe. He was a charming gentleman, and he had a lot of stories, of course. And it really piqued my interest in writing something about the air war to show that experience in these Billy Boyle books. But I didn't know how to get Billy up in a plane and have it be logical. And then I was at a Sleuthfest conference, the Mystery Writers Conference in Florida, with Reed Farrell Coleman, and he suggested, Jim, you ought to send Billy to Russia, have him meet Joe Stalin or something. And I thought that was kind of a silly idea, but all of a sudden I started thinking about Cousin Abe, and I knew about these bomber bases in Russia, and I thought, well, maybe there's a murder on one of these bases, and what's the quickest way to get Billy there? In a B-17 on a bombing raid, and they're going to this air base. And then about 2 years ago, well, it was more than that, but 2 years ago, a documentary called Cold Blue came out. And they had found unused color footage from World War II from the director William Wiley, who did the documentary The Memphis Belle, about a bomber crew on their 25th and final mission. So there was this unknown trove of colored footage. And it is an incredible documentary to watch, because it showed me so much I didn't know about the air war, that these guys flew in these B-17s that had open windows, no pressure, no heat, temperatures 60 degrees below zero, and people are trying to kill you. So in a very visceral sense, it gave me a way to look at what that experience was like. So as this book opens up, Billy is in a B-17 as an extra crew member, going through this bombing run and being shot at, and having that whole experience that I tried to make as true as I could to what those crews endured. And there's a scene in which they've dropped their bombs, but the last bomb is stuck in the bomb rack, and Billy has to walk out on this catwalk with no parachute because there's not enough room, and jump up on and down on the bomb to dislodge it. And Cousin Abe did that. That was the story he told. It's really in honor of him and all those men who endured all that. And it was really, I think I know a lot about World War II, but that was a deeper layer that I learned about what it was like for them up in the cold blue.
Sure. Yeah, and it does. I mean, there are so many great action sequences in this book. And again, you're reading it and he's kicking the bomb, trying to knock it out of the plane, and talk about, again, truth being stranger than fiction, because who would have thought that came from an actual life experience that you learned about. And so Billy does get sort of tasked with investigating these two deaths in a locked room, and he ends up having to join forces with Captain Sidorov, who readers of your earlier books might be familiar with. And that's, I think, some of the fun of these books, is that each one can stand alone, but there are threads that sometimes get pulled from book to book. But they have a really, unique dynamic given their past. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how that dynamic, how the relationship heightens the particular suspense of this book, and also how the title is a reflection of Sidorov's experiences, right. What Road of Bones means.
Yeah, let me start with the title. Road of Bones comes from a 1,000-kilometer road that Stalin ordered built from a port on the Pacific up towards Siberia, and he used slave labor, prison labor, to do it. They had all these political prisoners in the 1930s in these camps. They didn't call it the Gulag back then. That term came a little later, but it was the Gulag. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners. So they used them to build the road in the permafrost, permanently frozen tundra, with very primitive tools. And the working conditions were such that tens of thousands of laborers died. And because the ground was frozen, except where they were building the road, as the prisoners died, they just buried them in the roadbed. And the records weren't kept of the deaths, but they estimate between a minimum of 250,000 and maybe up to 1 million prisoners died building that road. And there's some statistic about 300 to 600 prisoners per kilometer are buried in that roadbed. So Sidorov, through well, I won't explain it, but he was sentenced to a prison camp. And when Billy is sent to investigate this double murder in a locked room, one American and one Russian, the Russians pluck Sidorov from a prison camp because he knows Billy. And of course, the message he is given is, find the murderer and it will be an American.
Right.
So he's faced with trying to solve the murder in a way that will please his superiors and save his own life. And Billy is tasked with, solving the murder and not creating an international incident. So they have tension from the get-go. And Billy pretty much knows what Sidorov's agenda is, because he quickly comes to understand the nature of this totalitarian state. And that's one of the things that interested me was, showing that at the same time we were fighting a totalitarian state, we were allied with a different totalitarian state, and one that even got its tentacles even farther into the population and wanted them to be controlled to a degree that was literally unbelievable. So showing that was a challenge. That was interesting. And I'll just mention about the locked room. I have found that the easiest way to plot out the murder mystery aspect of these books is to create a situation in which I don't know the answer. So I put these two bodies in this essentially locked room, And I had no idea who killed them or even necessarily why, although I had germ of an idea. And I just let the characters populate the story. I bring in old characters, new characters, and just let their dynamics work against each other until at some point it becomes apparent who did it.
Sure. I thought you were going to say at that point, when you have your idea, you turn it over to Debbie and say who did it and why. But no,
I'm always asking him, do you know who did it yet? Do you know who did it yet? Nope.
and he was hoping you'd tell him. And so, we talked a bit about the bombers, but I wanted to ask you too, there's this really great element in here, the night witches, which I had not heard of before. And it's sort of this group of really fierce female flyers. That was a lot of F's, and I apologize.
Yeah.
But one thing I really like about your books is that you're always exploring opportunities to showcase, how some of minority groups were used to aid in the war effort that we might not know about and appreciate. So can you talk about them specifically, and then how you like to look for those groups that have been marginalized but did make great contributions to the war effort?
Yep. In the Soviet Union, there were some opportunities for women. Before the war, there were flying clubs were very popular. So the state, you didn't own an airplane, the state owned the airplanes. So there were flying clubs that men and women could join and learn how to fly. And a lot of women took to them. When the war broke out, there was one woman pilot who somehow had access to Stalin, and at a meeting proposed to him that she'd be allowed to recruit a regiment of female pilots. And for whatever reason, Stalin approved of the plan. So they had three elements. They had a bomber group, a fighter group, and then they had the night witches. And so this is one of the airplanes. You can see it's a biplane. The night witches were night bombers, and they flew these old biplanes that were really literally crop dusters that were adapted for the war effort. And one thing about these three different regiments, it was all women, the mechanics, the cooks, the commanders. It was the only, as far as I know, the only literally all female air unit in the history of the military worldwide. And the night witches, their job was to fly these old planes with really small bomb loads at night and harass the Germans so they never had a moment's peace. So if there was a German installation behind the lines, a supply dump, rear area, they would fly there and then they would cut their engines and glide in quietly, drop their bombs, and then start up their engines. And the Germans called them night witches or Nachthexen. And they hated them so much, there was a bounty out. If you captured a night witch, you got an Iron Cross and a bunch of cash. And this was a visceral hatred because this was the Eastern Front. So the women, there was a pilot and a navigator in each plane. And the women carried sidearms, not so much to defend themselves if they were downed, but to shoot themselves, because to be captured by the Germans was not a pretty sight. And ironically, I guess, after the war, there was a big victory parade in Moscow. Every unit was represented, except the bomber, the fighter, and the night witches regiment were not invited. And they were just like, go back to your farms, fly your crop dusters, but we're not interested. So yes, they were marginalized, absolutely, and they were incredibly brave because these things were matchboxes. It was just canvas and wood, a gas tank that could be ignited at any moment, and they carried flares because the navigator would drop flares over the target, so the pilot could glide the plane in and hit them. So carrying flares, being shot at, there's a lot of danger involved. And I struggled to come up with a scenario in which Billy could hitch a ride on one of these planes and have the experience and show the reader through that what it was like. And I hope that was fairly realistic.
Yeah, well, I think so. And that's one of the things I love about these books too. People who might not be inclined to pick up a nonfiction book about the war, they pick up this and you learn so many things that you're not going to find necessarily in a textbook, which I think says something, for the lens of fiction. And so before we move on to final questions, just one more question for you. So Billy Boyle sort of has this trio of allies. It's him and it's Big Mike and Kaz, and they have this great formidable friendship. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how that's evolved, throughout the course of the books, and how that also, it gives you on one hand the ability to sort of heighten the stakes because you're not just concerned about Billy and his safety, but you have his friends as well. And then on the other hand, there's also this great opportunity, to add some levity that sort of offsets the somberness of war.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad you picked up on that, because it does provide for some comic relief, because Big Mike is a big guy. And Kaz is a very diminutive, slight, urbane, cosmopolitan person, very well educated. And he's particularly handy because Kaz knows everything. So if I need to explain something to the reader, Billy can say, well, I don't know what's going on here. And Kaz will say, well, of course, blah, 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 blah. And you buy it because Kaz, speaks 6 languages and just knows everything. And Big Mike is more grounded, more earthy. And having the 3 of them together allows me to pick and choose. This scene might be better with Big Mike as a foil to Billy. This one might be better with Kaz. And it also gives, there's more danger. So now I've got 2 people that Billy has to worry about, or 3 with Diana, circumstances she finds herself in. So I think their dynamic is part of the appeal. And Big Mike just kind of walked into the book. I think it was the 3rd book. He was just a walk-on character. And then all of a sudden he's wormed his way into the crowd, and he's part of the crew now. So, and there have been some characters that I introduced along the way that just sort of fell flat for me and didn't move on. But every now and then one comes along and they just make a connection with the character and hopefully the reader.
Yeah, it's terrific, and it's a great reason to revisit the books. I mean, not only do you get the great standalone plot, but you get to see how these friends evolve and the situations they get themselves in and hopefully out of. So final questions, and the first one I think you probably both broached a bit, but I always like to ask for the aspiring writers who are watching out there. And again, this goes with giving yourself permission to be a writer, with a capital W. But in looking back, in terms of a creative or writing life, can you tell us what the best advice you've ever been given was, and then the best advice that you were never given and had to learn for yourself throughout the experience of writing? And I will start with you, Debbie. Lucky you.
Okay, well, the best advice, and Jim has used this for years, saying this was his best advice, so I got it from him, is applying the seat of your pants to the seat of your chair. Which, so I watched him for all these years. You don't get to just write a book. It doesn't happen if you're, going out shopping and babysitting grandkids or doing this or doing that. You really have to. I watched him give up a lot and really make that commitment to, I'm going to write, and all these other things have to get let go of. So I really took that to heart, and I write about that in the book because we focused on that in our group. Is what are we all going to let go? Because we all realize that something has to go if you really want to write a book. So that's important. And I had kind of tweaked your question a little bit, because this is the best advice I ever heard that I ignored.
Sure.
So in a sense, I had to learn it on my own. And that is that as you're writing, I sat down and with my dead body, I just blurted it out on paper. And I know many of us are pantsers, and we just write what comes up. We don't organize. But even as a pantser, keep lists for yourself of scenes, of characters. What are their qualities? What color hair do they have? I mean, it's amazing as an editor to read people's books, and the hair color changes. So to keep track of the details for yourself, if you have a dialect in the book, make sure you write that down, because trust me, you're not going to remember how somebody pronounced something 3 chapters down the road. So I had gone to a whole weekend workshop on doing this, and then I totally ignored it and didn't do it. And it's much harder to go back and go through it and figure it all out than it is to keep track.
I think my best advice, given that I remembered what the teacher said from my period 5 English class in 1963, make it a little harder for your protagonist. That's what it boils down to. It's easy to have an idea for a plot and move the character through, but you've got to keep putting up realistic obstacles for them to overcome in a realistic way. And I mean, that literally has stayed with me for half a century, so I think it was probably pretty memorable. And the thing that nobody prepared me for was the degree of patience and perseverance that you need to have. Stopped counting at 200 rejections and kept going. And it helps to have kind of a stubborn Irish-German background, because you just don't want to give up and admit that you're a failure. So it took a long, long time. And then keeping up, once I got the foot in the door and the first contract, persevering with continuing the work and improving it. It's constant. But if you give up, you got nothing.
That is very true. And I also would agree that, as Debbie mentioned, apply, seat of pants to chair. Yep. Nothing happens if you don't do it. And I'm not sure if you realized this when you first gave your advice, Jim, but you said what it all boils down to. Boils down.
That was a pretty hard-boiled response.
I love wordplay. Okay, so final question. Just wondering if you can each give us a little teaser of what we may see next from you. And again, we'll start with Debbie.
Okay, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit to My Dead Body. And what came out of that experience for me was that on the Friday night after I found the dead body, I was at a young adult, it was under 21 dance bar, not, juice bar, dance club, live music. And literally this guy walked up to me, and this is I think the strangest pickup line I've ever heard, but hey, aren't you the girl that found a dead body? It's like, well, the long and the short of it is, years later, I married that person. So this was before Jim. I married him, and we had 2 sons, and then got rid of the guy. He was not who I needed to be with. This is who I needed to be with. But I had my 2 sons, and we have 7 grandchildren. Not one of those grandchildren would be alive today if I hadn't found that dead body. Mm-hmm. And, I just look at how every single thing that happens to us is a thread in the tapestry of our lives. And you just don't ever know how it's going to turn out, but everything has to happen as it happens. So soon as I'm done promoting this book, I'm going to get back to My Dead Body, and people can stay tuned to see what happens to Hannah when she finds a dead body on the last day of her sophomore year in high school.
Most excellent. And Mr. Benn.
Okay, we're finishing up the manuscript to send into Soho Press for next year's title, which is Shadows. And do you know the song, the Leonard Cohen song, The Partisan?
No, I don't.
Well, it's a song that he made famous. I think it's actually called The Partisan Song. And it was originally commissioned by the French government in exile during the war to keep up the morale of the resistance fighters, and they would broadcast it over the radio. And the song ends with "Men will come from the shadows." But it's really as much about the resistance fighters during the war as it is to what their life will be like after the war. They'll still be in the shadows. So we're going to explore an episode of defeat of the French resistance, what the implications were for that. And if the title holds, it'll be Shadows next year.
Oh, fascinating. Fabulous. Maybe next year you'll sing us a bit of that song. We'll have you back.
Oh, you don't want
No,
that.
you don't want that.
No musical numbers.
But check out The Partisan by Leonard Cohen on YouTube or something. It's a great song.
Beautiful.
That's terrific. And in the meantime, people can check out Deborah Mandel's All Right and James Benn's Road of Bones. You can savor them until what comes next comes next. Thank you both so much, my friends, for being here today.
Thank you very much, John.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.